Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining the WE conference today. It is a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Heather Ibrahim Leathers, and I am the founder and president of the Global Fund for Widows. It's a pleasure to be here, and my greatest and sincerest wish is that we could be together in person, but for the time being, it is my privilege to present to you today on the issue of global widows virtually. Widowhood in the developing world is very different from the widowhood issue here in the United States and throughout the global north, in fact. And an additional layer of complexity is added to widows of Africa, for example, and South Asia as a result of different rights and entitlements which they don't have. And so if you'll indulge me, I'd love to be able to share with you some of those complexities today. So widowhood in the developing world, in the United States, I believe that we have some 13 million widows, if I'm not mistaken. When we think about widowhood in general as a human rights platform, however, we tend to think of it as not really an issue. It doesn't occur to people when we mention widowhood. Usually they look to us with sort of deer in headlights, deer in headlights views. But to give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem, if I were to say apartheid, we all understand what that is and how many people it affected. It, in fact, if you include men, women, children, whites, and Blacks, apartheid affected some 33 million people. And we may not have heard about it until the early to mid 80s. However, the human rights violation of apartheid existed from the turn of the century. And if you think about FGM, for example, we all understand what FGM is today, but about 10 or 15 years ago, that wasn't something that the general population understood. FGM impacts 200 million people around the world. Widowhood, on the other hand, impacts 300 million people, women in the world. Excuse me, yet it remains virtually unknown. Part of the reason why this is true is that the definition of widowhood itself tends to be quite complex. Global Fund for Widows has three real issues or three ways in which we think about widowhood. The first is the de facto widow, whose husband is in fact deceased. But how do you define husband? Here in the United States and in the global north, there is a registered document sitting with the government that recognizes this marriage and this union to be legal, which allows the widow to have certain rights. However, in the developing world and in the global south, that's not often the case. There are often customary or informal marriages, most of them in fact, which are never recorded with the government. And so as soon as the husband passes away, his family, who has his birth certificate, runs out, collects the death certificate, comes back and says, "What are you doing here?" to his widow. And she says, "What do you mean what I'm doing here? I live here. This is my home. I've been living with you for the last 15, 20 years. These are your grandchildren. We don't know who you are. Get out." And it begins the process of her disinheritance. The second is what Global Fund for Widows calls the functional widow. This is a widow whose husband has abandoned her. Has he abandoned her for voluntary reasons, or has he abandoned her for involuntary reasons? Is that involuntary reason the action of a state, or is that an action of a non-state actor, such as Boko Haram or the Taliban? Is the Taliban or Boko Haram going to dignify the widow by giving her a death certificate for the disappearance of her husband? Unlikely. And so those widows live in a doom loop, I would say, of uncertainty, where they're unable to progress as actual widows because their husbands might be alive. So they're not entitled to inheritance. They're not entitled to Social Security if it's available in their country. And they're not entitled to grieving. And then the third is the forced marriage widow. These are usually girls who wake up in the morning, go to school, are abducted in the afternoon, and then are forcibly married to their abductors for long periods of time. We celebrate them when they return, if they're lucky enough to return. And we say, our girls are back. The truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter whether or not we recognize the marriage that they were in as legitimate or not. The truth is that their communities ostracize them, and that's something that we need to be cognizant of. Global Fund for Widows has a global footprint. We are in 8 countries and expanding almost as quickly as we can for the high demand of the work that we're doing. And as a former investment banker, I usually start by understanding who our widows are. And so anytime we enter into a country, we do a baseline survey. And one of the things that struck me the most as we entered into these conversations was the preconceived notion that I had, at least, that widows are older ladies. In fact, 76% of the widows that we work with in Tanzania were widowed under the age of 29, and 99% of them were widowed under the age of 39. The same thing is true in Egypt, or similarly, it's true in Egypt, where 53% of our widows were widowed before the age of 39. And we're finding the same to be true in Malawi and India and other countries in which we operate. Why is this important? Well, if a woman is widowed before the age of 39, it invariably means that she is mother to young children to whom she's responsible for educating and providing health for and providing security for. And herein lies the big issue. So we've spent a lot of time trying to analyze this issue and understand this issue of the human rights violations against widows. And we've really unpacked it into 3 main themes. The first is what I would call disinheritance, in which I alluded to before. It's basically the fact that widows are removed from when their husbands die, widows lose that household income, as usually the male in these patriarchal societies are the main breadwinner. When she loses that income, she also loses the rights to stay in that home. The family would like to disinherit her, as it's an extra mouth to feed, and they don't want her around, so that they would split up the assets that they feel that they're entitled to, especially if there was a dowry paid for the wedding. If the husband's family paid a dowry for the bride, essentially they consider her as property. So disinheritance essentially is the phenomenon of the widow not being able to access income, assets, land, perhaps even land that she purchased or worked on herself during the marriage. And approximately 40% of widows in the developing world are disinherited. So this is not a small or meaningless phenomenon. The second is what we call discrimination. And I'm not talking about just discriminating against a poor widow. I'm talking about structural, legal, cultural barriers that prevent the widow from accessing opportunities such as justice, or things such as her own inheritance, or her own children oftentimes, as sometimes they're taken away from her because their rights to the estate is higher than hers based on the patrilineage or matrilineage line in which she comes from. And then oftentimes she's unable to access decent work or capital. For example, what we found in our work is that oftentimes a widow would like access to capital in order to start a small business to provide for her children. So she goes to a microfinance organization, or a microfinance organization comes to her and they say, sure, we would love to give you $100 loan. Where's your collateral? Well, I don't have any collateral because I was disinherited by my husband's family. Okay, no problem. Where's your male cosigner? I don't have a male cosigner because my husband passed away and I was disinherited by my husband's family. And so these structural barriers are what actually prevent the widow from moving forward. And then the final human rights violation is what we refer to as harmful traditional practices. These are often violent, often including sexual violence, and oftentimes also including violence against the widow's children. And these are 44% of widows experience these types of violations to their human rights. These harmful practices are conducted with impunity. It might be once, it might be multiple times. There might be a statute of limitations. There might never be a statute of limitations, in which case she is abused and raped for a very long period of time. These violations always are unprotected, which means she becomes subject to HIV/AIDS. And they're often endorsed, sadly, by the culture, meaning these cleansing rites, we're going to cleanse the widow of the sin of her husband's death, is something that she has to endure in order to be reaccepted into society once her husband dies. What do these violations actually mean? Well, in terms of disinheritance, I'll give you a quick example. The widow loses access to income. And remember, she's only 38 years old, and so she's responsible for young children. She loses rights to the house that she lived in, and so now she becomes destitute and almost homeless, if not fully homeless. In the developing world, she also is responsible for paying school fees on a monthly basis in order to be able to send her children to school. So now, without that basic income, her children almost immediately come out of school. What happens then? Well, the widow will tell us immediately that she will turn to child marriage to protect her daughter. And so she will marry her daughter off as a child for the daughter's own protection. What happens to the boys? Well, the boys are then often recruited by extremists, gangs, drug dealers, etc. And so that you see that one episode or that one event of widowhood triggers an absolutely awful downward cycle of impoverishment, hunger, poor health, poor education, child marriage, extremist recruitment. And then, of course, the children become vulnerable, as does the widow, to things such as undignified work and human trafficking, quite frankly. And so these are just some of the triggers that occur as a result of widowhood. At the Global Fund for Widows, what we've done is essentially created this, what I call tragic wheel of intersectionalities that basically show that 12 of the 16 or 17 SDGs can never be reached until we address the issue of widowhood, because of this tragic intersectionality of how this impacts the SDGs. What do we do? Global Fund for Widows, as an operator in the field, listened to what the widows had to say. And the widows essentially told us we need access to capital. In fact, 70% of the widows, they said their number one need is access to capital and decent work. And so what we did is we created a bank, because we realized the structural barriers prevented the widows from actually accessing any kind of capital. We created our own bank, what we call the Widows Savings and Loan Association, or WSALA for short, is based on a very familiar banking model that the unbanked populations of the world use. And the WSALA essentially requires widows to join together in groups of 25. Our teams in the field train them on how to save money, on how to meet, on how to organize, on how to elect leadership, on how to register with their WSALAs with the government. And then during this period of time, the widows are earning something on the order of 1/3 of the cost it is to start a small business. So for example, if it costs $100 in Kenya to start a small vegetable stand, each of the widows who want to start a small vegetable stand or a salon or whatever, they'll go out and they'll start working and saving the equivalent of 1/3 of that $100, so $33. And then when they're ready, after about 3 months, they bring that $33 to the bank. At that time, Global Fund for Widows matches the widow's investment on a 2-for-1 basis. So for every dollar that the widow brings in, Global Fund for Widows gives her 2, and that money goes into the bank. Now, the widow doesn't need to wait for a loan. She can borrow from herself today, the full $100, and go out and launch her own micro enterprise. What we found is that the widows, once they receive that money and they start working, the first thing that they do is that they put their children back in school. The second thing that they do is improve the nutrition of their households. The third thing that they do is improve the health of their households and the health condition of their households. And finally, with the excess profits from their successful businesses, they come back with savings and put more money into their banks and purchase more shares, meaning they're increasing their wealth and their savings, and the bank's capital has also increased. Now the widows can borrow more money, which will earn more interest income when they pay their loans back to themselves with interest, and hence launches a virtuous cycle. What we have found is that widows are becoming extremely wealthy from this program and are moving into empowerment within their communities. We've seen widows actually double the size of their banks in the first year. And with the excess funds, they're doing amazing things, such as pooling the funds to start a computer lab for their community, or pooling those excess funds and starting a laundromat, or pooling those funds and starting a grain grinding mill. And we even have one group that started a school. This is what one of our banks looks like. And these are the returns. In fact, oftentimes we see that within the first year, widows can earn a 500% return on their initial investment. And to be honest, that's about 4 years ahead of what we had projected. What are our success metrics? Well, in Egypt, we have found that widows increase their income by about 50% in the first year. And in Kenya, we've seen them increase their income by about 100% in the first year. We've seen the overall bank capital grow anywhere between 50 to 100%, and that increase in wealth, as I mentioned, anywhere from 50 to 500%. We've also seen them increase their health and nutritional spend by 33%. 99% of children return to school. And we've even seen widows assume a path to public life, with 3 widows seeking election in Tanzania and one of them successful in her bid. I'd love to share with you in closing a video of the first bank that we established in Kenya, in a slum in Kenya called Korogocho. This was as the widows are putting the money in their bank for the first time and purchasing those shares, that initial investment. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present to you today. We continue our work across the world, empowering some 20,000 widows, 52,000 of their children. We've established almost 100 wasalas to date, and during COVID lockdowns have fed over 6.5 million meals to widows across the world. And with that, I thank you for your time. I wish you all of the best. And we hope to see you again, hopefully in person next year at the Next Week conference. Thank you so much.